Hi, I'm Matt Cedillo, Literary Director of the Dawes Center for the Arts, and the guest curator for this year's dAtzlan exhibit, Movimiento. This is the 16th year the DAW has presented dAtzlan. We would be remiss to continue without beginning to acknowledge and celebrate the legacy established by Frank and Kathy Garcia, who has been putting on dAtzlan celebrations for the past 15 years. This is the first year that they've kind of stepped away. I'm deeply honored to kind of step into that role. This year, we're presenting Timelines Movimiento alongside the exhibit. And again, we speak to the strength of memory. The strength of memory is what gives us the grounding in the present to understand the present and therefore fight for the future. In that spirit, I will show you our timelines. Here, we have the work of Lupe Carrasco, who helped us establish a timeline here on ethnic studies, the history of ethnic studies. This is a history of education and our fight to better understand the present, to better understand what is happening in the world and why it is happening and how it is happening. Lupe Carrasco is the chair of ARE here in Los Angeles, California, as well as someone who worked on the model curriculum that is being right now fought for in California legislature. Down here we have Mark Torres, the director of the Pacific Archive, as well as a radio host for Travel Tips for dAtzlan, and he is going to be presenting on the history of what he has referred to as the soundtrack of the movement. We're very, very excited to have Mark as well. We are joined by Rosemary Soto Rodriguez, who has given us this wonderful timeline on the development of Chicano theater, also known as teatro. They will be joining us, Teatro Urbano. She's the director of Teatro Urbano, who will be joining us delivering a play, The Silver Dollar, here at the Dawes Center for the Arts in our exhibit, dAtzlan. She is the set of The Silver Dollar is also going to be part of the exhibit, so we're really, really excited and honored to be working with Teatro Urbano both on this timeline, the exhibit, and having them here to play, to give us The Silver Dollar. And finally, we're joined by Gabriel Gutierrez, the chair of Chicana Studies at Cal State Northridge, viewing the Movimiento through the lens of labor, guiding the economics of our oppression and the politics of our resistance. We here at the Dawes Center for the Arts could not be prouder to present Movimiento, Timelines.
We're not getting these educations in our regular classroom, and we want to not just be receiving your version of history. We want to be respected. We want our histories to be taught.
We see students organizing. Here in the Southwest, we have the East LA High School walkouts. We see the Chicano Moratorium, and there is a soundtrack to this.
We would perform in the parks because, well, the majority of people would gather on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon at a park, and we'd throw a show right there.
Once we arrive at our own dignity, we begin to dignify others. If we don't have something along those lines that's a very basic tenet, then we're not going to act.
When you allow students to express themselves through the arts, it's very healing. And while it's healing, it's also an opportunity for them to imagine a better world.
We have been able to show them that we're a tool that's important. A speaker could get up and speak and talk, but it's different when you visually see what the speaker is talking about.
And you take immediate action. You start in your house, you start street by street, block by block, so on and so forth, right? Acting collectively, reclaiming.
There has to be a soundtrack. There has to be a reason for people to protest and resist. And that reason is to enjoy the beauty of our culture.
Hi, I'm Lupe Carrasco Cardona. I'm a teacher at Roybal High School, and I'm also the chair of the Association of Raza Educators. I am part of the Coalition for Ethnic Studies Now and several other educational things. So when you look at what has been happening since the 1960s with the Third World Liberation Front in San Francisco, at San Francisco State University, they literally shut down the whole school system for quite a long time, and were demanding to have Black studies, Chicano studies, various intersectional studies, because they were saying that we're not getting these educations in our regular classroom, and we want to not just be receiving your version of history, just just empty receptacles that are just getting your bullet points of what you think that we need to know. They were saying we need to have a more holistic education. And so you also saw that in like East Los Angeles with the 1968 walkouts. I mean, we've seen it across the country. There was walkouts in Azusa, walkouts throughout, like in Chicago and whatnot. And folks were really just saying, we want to be respected. We want our histories to be taught. And if you look at the movement since then, you'll see that there were successful times when this really happened. In Tucson, for instance, there was a Mexican American Studies program. And so they were not just teaching history that was relevant to the students, but they were also teaching about like indigenous ways of knowing. And here's the thing, is all human beings come from somewhere, right? And all human beings have a genealogy of ways of thinking, epistemologies that's indigenous to where they come from. But with modern society, capitalism and whatnot, we've been stripped of that. We're pretty much taught to become consumers, to reproduce, in this case, the society that we live in, which is a very consumer-based capitalistic system. And there's a lot of issues with that. But one of the issues is that it prevents students from becoming educated about who they are, where they come from, and how our ancestors who, have a whole lot of knowledge about how to coexist with another human being, how to coexist with this earth so that we can keep this earth thriving for the next 7 generations and beyond, right? 700 generations, hopefully. And so in Tucson, they were really teaching that. They were saying, this is the way your ancestors knew how to interact with the self, with the community, with the earth, and that really freaked folks out. The Association of Raza Educators, I am the chair of the chapter in Los Angeles, but the way that the whole organization was founded was in San Diego, and this was 1994 during the height of what was going on with Prop 187, very similar to Arizona's SB 1070. And so the folks out there, teachers who are critical pedagogues, who are very much about cultural relevancy and protecting the community, self-determination, decided that they needed to come together in a manner to start discussing how to protect the students. Prop 187 was, very anti-immigrant, and it was very similar to the Show Me Your Papers law of Arizona. And so it was founded, it became, very instrumental in protecting students' rights, and then eventually it expanded to Los Angeles and Sacramento because we have students throughout the state that are in need of that sort of protection in the classroom. In addition to that, the Association of Raza Educators has really been a part of the ethnic studies movement that is currently happening in California. I mean, we've had this movement towards ethnic studies for the past 50 years, but it got sort of reignited after what happened in Arizona with HB 2281 and other laws that were very much against Mexican American studies. And so we've been instrumental here in trying to be on the offensive, like get it passed as a graduation requirement, make it part of the system that students would be exposed to ethnic studies instead of having to fight for it later when similar types of attacks on ethnic studies could occur in California. We know that art expression, art production, art creation is instrumental in helping students to, express themselves. It's also instrumental in learning history, learning what's going on in society. So we are very much proponents of bringing in theater, bringing in visual, all types of visual and performing arts essentially into classrooms. When you allow students to express themselves through the arts, it's very healing. And while it's healing, it's also an opportunity for them to imagine a better world. So we really promote the arts because going through that process is really about developing a plan of action for transforming the society that we live in now. A lot of times folks think of, things that are empowering for students, things that are going to help students, move to social action. They usually think that those things live in the area of social studies. And so we're really about saying, yes, social studies is important, right? All of the social studies, but the arts is really instrumental sometimes in being able to touch students on a personal level. And for that reason, when I was part of the 18-member team of the Ethnic Studies Model Curriculum Advisory Committee for the model curriculum for the state of California, I really was adamant that we needed to add the arts. So we were able to get a Luis Alfaro play called Mojada, a Medina in Los Angeles. And essentially, it's this beautiful play that brings in, cultural elements like curandera is one of the main characters, and it talks about immigration, it talks about gentrification, it talks about things like acculturation and assimilation or resistance to that. And so in seeing this play, I'm even getting chills right now thinking about the play, but in seeing this play, this art form, you can really connect to what students are going through, either they themselves personally, or let's just keep it real, all of us have people in our neighborhoods and our classrooms that have experienced something like that. And so it's a really great way to develop empathy while at the same time, embedding the arts. So we're all about the arts, poetry, every form of visual and performing arts in schools.
My name is Mark Torres. I am the director of the Pacifica Radio Archives. I'm also the host of the longest running Chicano music show, Travel Tips for dAtzlan, starting in 1995. When I think about where our starting point is for resistance music, it's hard not to go back to the 1850s. One day Mexicans were Mexicans, and one day they were foreigners living in a foreign land. But we're gonna move forward to the 1930s and the 1940s with Lalo Guerrero. Lalo Guerrero literally made the word Chicano popular again. He may have even been credited with coining the term. So Lalo Guerrero came along at a time when the Pachucos was a cultural scene here in the United States, especially here in the Southwest. It had a style, it had a look, it had music, and Lalo Guerrero was the soundtrack to that. And just wearing those outfits was a rebellious act because they were targeted by police, they were targeted by Anglo members of the community who didn't understand what it was. They were subject to police abuse, imprisonment, and worse. And so Lalo taking that stand to be the soundtrack to that movement was really the starting point to the modern rebellion movement for the Chicano scene. With the United Farm Workers and a growing need to have a consciousness awakening moment in the Mexican-American community, and observing what took place in the civil rights movement before them with acts like Rosa Parks and her bus boycott action, the work of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the work of Malcolm X, the work of the Black Panthers, the Latino community felt like it was time. And that was somewhere around 1967 and 1968. At that point, the United Farm Workers is coming to the forefront of American consciousness, and also we see students organizing. Here in the Southwest, we have the East LA high school walkouts. We see the Chicano moratorium, and there is a soundtrack to this. And back in those times, even Lalo Guerrero, he is lending his celebrity and his voice, but there's also many folkloric groups that are forming at these times. There's groups like Flor del Pueblo de San Jose, Huicholes de Los Angeles, and these groups are popping up to create a resistance and protest soundtrack to these various movements. Student groups are picking up where Richie Valens left off, and the lyrical content is changing from love songs to protest songs. So we do see that music is integral with the social movements of those times. They go hand in hand. There has to be a soundtrack. There has to be a reason for people to protest and resist. And that reason is to enjoy the beauty of our culture. And so that culture has to participate in this resistance movement. There are times when our efforts get erased. We saw that with Richie Valens. He had to change his name. He agreed to change from Richard Valenzuela to Richie Valens. We saw that with Rosie in the Originals, where her original song, Angel Baby, had a Spanish verse, and the music industry didn't know how to deal with that. They erased the Spanish language verse. We see this time and time again. Rage Against the Machine is an interesting example because Zach De La Rocha's father was part of a famous muralist crew going back to the 1960s and 70s. And so Zach, even though he grew up in a very conservative Republican environment in Orange County, had his father to influence him on the movement, and that was very important with the lyrical content and the music that he made. Now, it's true, a lot of people do not know that Zach De La Rocha is Mexican-American, but at the same time, as soon as the Zapatistas arose in 1994, Zach De La Rocha was there. Zach De La Rocha ultimately did a show in Mexico City called, this was based off of his album Battle of Los Angeles, and he called the tour Battle of Mexico City. It was a sold-out show in the Deportes complex in the middle of Mexico City. They wanted to have it in the Zocalo, but the Mexican government would not allow it. He mandated that MTV wanted to video record it, and he mandated that if they do this, they have to include these messages by Subcomandante Marcos and Subcomandante Ramona, so that the Zapatista perspective is well known. So that live music video was very commercially successful, and it had a Zapatismo message, which I think for the most part the Zapatistas and their politics and their sense of community became absorbed in a large part in the Chicano movement. So yes, we're not represented very well, but we're here. Here in 2019, it's very exciting because unfortunately, with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, that stepped up musicians' game. Chicana musicians always want to be present when there's a chance to voice a story about injustice, racism, intolerance, sexism, attacks on our LGBTQ communities, and our musicians step up for this. There's groups like La Santa Cecilia. They sing songs about ICE. We have bands like Nancy Sanchez did a song, No Tengo Miedo, about the fear that kids feel when ICE comes around to your school and takes your parents out of their car, dropping you off at school, and separates you, and now imprisons you and separates you from your families. There are bands like Maya Jupiter, Quetzal, Martha Gonzalez. There's so many great, amazing groups. Janina Del Marco is one that writes music. She's not from the Chicano community, but I feel living in the Southwest, even if you're from the Dominican Republic, you can't help but feel the energy in the movement. There's groups like, also from Chile, we have Maria del Pilar. She is singing songs of protest. So there's some great music being made out there. dAtzlan Underground is one of the groups that started in the 1980s, and they're still doing that work today. It seems like every song, as apolitical as you could be, has to make a comment somewhere down the road. There's a group making movies that did a whole album called America, and it's protest music. Groups like Flor de Toloache, an all-female mariachi group from New York. They have songs about rebellion. They have songs about intolerance. So it's really not just here in the Southwest, but it's a bigger Latino concern because these forces are working to oppress people throughout Latin America. And we see that as the Amazon is burning today, intolerance, injustice, discrimination is rampant throughout Latin America, and we have to stick together as one.
My name is Rosemary Soto Rodriguez. I'm with Teatro Urbano, a Chicano theater group that has been in existence since the early 70s. And we do a play called The Silver Dollar, written by Rene Rodriguez. It's considered the longest running Chicano theater, and it's going to be shown at the dAtzlan show at the DA in Pomona on September 20th, 21st, and 23rd. The Chicano theater movement started because of the struggle with the farm workers. And we noticed that using Chicano theater is a form of expression, of getting out the word and educating people about different conditions that exist. And when you perform, people listen and they watch, and hopefully they take something home with them regarding the message we're trying to share. The movement has been very influential in giving us the material that's needed and the venues to perform. And we, the teatro people, have been a big influence by providing our form of expression, of sharing our conditions on stage, and letting the movement know that we are there to support and educate. Teatros during the day, back in the 70s, late 60s, we would perform in the parks because, well, the majority of people would gather on a Saturday or Sunday afternoon at a park, and we'd throw a show right there. Or we would perform community centers, colleges, theaters, and that's the whole thing about being able to do theater that's versatile and is able to be taken out to the people. Teatro Urbano has taken different subjects regarding gang violence, police brutality, education, and of course, again, the Silver Dollar, where LA Times reporter Ruben Salazar was killed at the bar of the Silver Dollar. We have been able to show them that we're a tool that's important. And a speaker could get up and speak and talk, but it's different when you visually see what the speaker is talking about. And we get a really great response from that. When we perform the Silver Dollar, we'll take a venue and convert it into the bar, not just on front, but the whole venue, just like we're going to do at the DAW. As you enter the DAW, you're going to be welcomed by the set of the Silver Dollar, and it's going to take you back to remembering what took place on that really important day to remember, which is August 29th, 1970. You'll come walking in through the DAW, and you'll see the set, the bar, and better yet, if you come to a performance, you're going to see the live performance of the day that Ruben Salazar was assassinated at the Silver Dollar on August 29, 1970.
My name is Gabriel Gutierrez. I'm the chair and professor of Chicana and Chicano Studies at Cal State Northridge. What happens is that during the Spanish-Mexican period, we're talking about then indigenous folks that are already being incorporated, but they're being incorporated at lower levels of society, right? In the aftermath of the Mexican-American War, you have these contentions throughout the Southwest in terms of implementing very highly, racially based policies that deal with participation on all levels: economic, political, cultural, so on and so forth. And so what happens is that part of the congressional discussion leading to the Mexican-American War in the United States has to deal with validation or social constructs that validate the acts that follow. So among the conversations in the congressional record, you're going to find discussions regarding the mongrel race, right, that exists to the west and is part of the frontier, and that therefore is validly targeted, right, according to those folks. In the Spanish Mexican culture, you already have a hierarchy that's based in part on race that has to deal with the construction of the casta system. And so what happens is that the U.S., from the U.S. vantage point, there isn't really very much of a distinction, because the one drop, rule basically designates anyone who is not white, who is not, WASP, basically, to be deserving of these marginal roles in society. So the dispossession of land, the dispossession of workplace comes in part as a way of creating sort of an affirmative action for white property males, because you're going to have, in the aftermath of the U.S.-Mexican War, the growth of industry, right? And so you're going to have certain jobs that are going to be relegated to white men exclusively, right? And these are policies, or these are practices, even in terms of trade unions, for example, that are intended to create opportunities for white folks that are coming at the expense of limiting folks of color, indigenous people, Mexicans, Asians, Chinese in particular, and other such folks. And you're going to find this in things like the foreign miners tax, for example, right? During the gold rush era in 1850, that resulted in people who are considered foreigners being taxed. I think it was like $40 for a claim that they made on at a mine site. Whereas people who had just arrived, who were themselves actually foreigners, were not being charged that tax. So how do you designate that? Well, you go by skin color. You go by the tangible sort of characterizations. When placed in a larger context, helps to define a lot of what happens within the Chicano movement. And then it also helps to expose a lot of the apparent contradictions within, like, the movement philosophies along and across generational lines. So if we're going to look at the impact of World War II, then we also have to look at least to the beginning of the 20th century and a lot of the different dynamics that are taking place here. Among them is you're going to have what Mario Garcia calls the immigrant generation, right? That comes of age politically during the 19th century, early 20th century. And so that generation politically, has the tendency of being born in Mexico. They're more monolithic Spanish speaking. There's a maintenance and sustaining of Mexican cultural customs, right? And it also coincides with a lot of other things that are happening during the 1920s and the 1930s. And among them, if we look at Los Angeles, for example, you have the designation in 1923, I believe, of a zone that is called the Central Manufacturing District, which today basically is the area between Soto Street and Garfield. Folks have began to designate that space as an industrial space, right? This is really important, because what's going to happen after, especially after World War II, is that, this is where that region and those zones get their origins from. So you're going to have a high concentration of industry. You're going to have the government actually subsidizing at the local, state, federal levels through different types of legislation, the growth of capital, the growth of industry. And one of the consequences of that is going to be quality of life for people that are working in these areas and people that begin to occupy these spaces as residential spaces, right? So when we find then, we moving into the so-called Chicana generation or the Mexican American generation, before that, where this is the same time where you're going to have some form of social mobility. You're going to have, the Mexican American generation being primarily U.S. born, English speaking, professional, college educated, so on and so forth. And they take on more this identity of being American, right? And this is significant because as Americans, then you're entitled to the same rights as everybody else. There are different ways and mechanisms, I think, that people can utilize to begin to address circumstances of today. I think at the very root of that is the very question of dignity. Once we arrive at our own dignity, we begin to dignify others. If we don't have something along those lines as a very basic tenet, then we're not going to act. We're not going to respond in constructive ways to create change, to bring about change. And that, I think, in many ways needs to be underscored because without having that self-actualization, other things aren't really possible, right? And I'm saying that because we look at, I work at a university, and I look at the barrage of stuff that people have to deal with. And that has consequences on all kinds of different levels that require, right, cutting through all of that in order to be able to take one step, a couple steps at a time, in order to begin to address and redress much of what's happening. Once that comes about, right, then you also begin to sort of unpeel all these layers of things, traumas that people are dealing with. And you take immediate action. You start in your house, you start street by street, block by block, so on and so forth, right? Acting collectively, reclaiming, right? Retaking. And it's not just a matter of space, right? But resources. That becomes a really important part of this equation, right? Where we take ownership and we start to take things back.